In 1969, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo ran a strange experiment. He parked two identical cars on two different streets, one in a rough part of the Bronx, one in a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Palo Alto. Then he left the cars there, untouched, just waiting. The car in the Bronx was stripped for parts within 24 hours. The car in Palo Alto sat untouched for over a week. So, Zimbardo did something interesting. He walked up to the pristine car in Palo Alto and smashed one window with a sledgehammer. Within hours, that car was gutted, torn apart, destroyed by people who, a week earlier, wouldn't have touched it. One broken window was all it took to signal something invisible but devastating. Nobody is watching. Nobody cares. This thing has no protection. That single experiment became the seed for one of the most important ideas in behavioral psychology, the broken windows theory. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. It doesn't just apply to cars or neighborhoods or crime rates. It applies to you. It applies to the way people perceive your worth, your authority, your boundaries, your respect. And the scariest part isn't that respect can be lost. It's how it's lost. Not in one dramatic moment, not in a single explosive fight or a public failure. It's lost the way that car was lost, one small, unnoticed crack at a time, until one day you look up and realize the whole structure is gone, and you can't even point to the moment it happened. In this video, we are going to explore 6 psychological reasons why people slowly stop respecting you. Quiet, invisible mechanisms that operate long before you ever notice the damage. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how to spot the first broken window before the whole thing gets stripped down to nothing. Here's a psychological truth that most people get backwards. Sudden loss is painful, but gradual loss is dangerous. When something happens all at once, a betrayal, a public humiliation, a screaming match, your brain registers it as an event. You can locate it, you can point to it, you can grieve it, learn from it, and course correct. But gradual loss doesn't work like that. It doesn't trip any alarms. Psychologists call this shifting baseline syndrome, a concept originally used in environmental science to describe how each generation accepts a degraded environment as normal simply because they never saw what came before. Applied to human relationships, it means this. If respect erodes by 1% a week, you never notice the 1%. You only notice the 100%. The day your opinion stops being asked for, the day your calls stop being returned quickly, the day people start talking over you in meetings you used to run. By the time you feel it, it's not a crack anymore. It's a demolished building. And the person standing in the rubble, that's you, wondering what happened, when the truth is you saw the first broken window a long time ago. You just didn't fix it. Let's break down exactly where those first cracks form. We are going to explore 6 psychological reasons why people slowly stop respecting you. Reason 1. The consistency discount. Robert Cialdini, one of the most cited psychologists in the study of influence, identified something called the consistency principle. Humans are wired to trust patterns and to instantly discount anyone whose word doesn't match their actions. Here's the brutal math behind it. Every time you say you'll do something and don't, you're not just failing at a task. You're teaching the people around you a lesson about how much your word is actually worth. And it compounds. The first broken promise gets forgiven. The 5th one gets remembered. The 10th one gets expected. At that point, people aren't disappointed when you flake. They're not even surprised. And an emotion far worse than anger has replaced their frustration, indifference. Nobody rebels against a car with one broken window. They just stop expecting it to be protected. Reason 2. The justification trap. Watch any room where someone starts explaining themselves before anyone even asked. Sorry I'm late, traffic was insane, and then my phone died, and then... Nobody demanded that explanation. It was volunteered. And every unsolicited justification is a tiny, invisible signal. I don't trust that my actions speak for themselves. Dasher Keltner, a psychologist who spent decades researching what he calls the power paradox, found something counterintuitive. The people who hold the most influence in a room are usually the ones who explain the least. Not because they're arrogant, because they don't operate from a place of anxious self-justification. The moment you start over-explaining every decision, every boundary, every no, you're not building trust. You're advertising insecurity. And people don't consciously think this person seems insecure. They just quietly recalibrate how much weight your opinion deserves. Another broken window, another signal that nobody's really watching the structure, including you. Reason 3, the emotional leak. Daniel Goleman coined the term amygdala hijack to describe what happens when your emotional brain overrides your rational one. When a small frustration turns into a raised voice, a sarcastic comment, a door slammed just a little too hard. It happens fast. It feels justified in the moment, and it costs you more than you think. Here's why. Humans build a mental model of the people around them, a kind of predictive simulation of how you'll react to stress. Every time that model gets updated with reacts poorly under pressure, you become someone to be managed, someone whose feelings need to be handled delicately, rather than someone whose judgment is trusted. Nobody says this out loud, but behavior changes. People start softening the truth around you, filtering information, walking on eggshells. That's not respect, that's damage control. And by the time you notice people are handling you instead of talking to you, the crack has already spread across the whole windshield. Reason 4, the approval spiral. This one is subtle, and it's the one that catches the most well-meaning people. Somewhere along the way, you started saying yes to things you didn't want to do, agreeing with opinions you didn't hold, softening your stance the moment someone pushed back. It felt like kindness. It felt like keeping the peace. But psychologically, something else was happening. Social exchange theory, one of the foundational frameworks in relationship psychology, states that respect operates like a currency of perceived value, and perceived value is built on scarcity, not availability. The moment your agreement becomes unconditional, it stops being valuable. Your yes only means something if your no is possible. Chase approval hard enough, long enough, and you don't get more respect. You get taken for granted. People don't resent the person who never bends. They quietly stop respecting the one who always does. Reason 5, the vanishing boundary. Boundaries are strange because the moment you set one, it feels like conflict. But the absence of one is what actually creates it later in a much uglier form. Every time a boundary gets crossed without consequence, a joke that goes too far, a favor that gets exploited, a just this once that becomes a pattern, you're not avoiding a confrontation. You're teaching people exactly where your edges actually are. And if your edges keep moving to accommodate whoever pushes hardest, you don't have boundaries anymore. You have suggestions, and nobody respects a suggestion. Reason 6, the overexposure effect. This is the strangest one because it inverts something we're taught to believe. We assume being available, present, and constantly accessible builds connection. Sometimes it does. But psychologically, familiarity without friction breeds something closer to invisibility. This is the inverse of the mere exposure effect studied extensively in social psychology. Repeated exposure builds fondness only up to a point, after which it flattens into background noise. If you're always available, always reachable, always the first to respond, you remove the one variable that makes any relationship, professional or personal, feel valuable, the possibility of loss. Respect requires a small, healthy fear of losing access to you. Remove that fear entirely, and you don't become more valued. You become furniture. Here's the good news buried inside all of this. Broken windows can be fixed. James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, the criminologists who built on Zimbardo's experiment and turned it into a citywide policy, proved this in the most dramatic way possible. In the early 1990s, New York City's transit police chief, William Bratton, applied broken windows theory to the subway system, which at the time was almost lawless, covered floor to ceiling in graffiti, plagued by fare jumping, littered with disorder. Instead of chasing violent crime directly, Bratton ordered every single subway car cleaned of graffiti before it was allowed back into service. He cracked down on fare evasion, a minor offense nobody thought mattered. Critics called it a waste of resources. Fix small things while the big crimes are happening. Within a few years, felony crime in the subway system dropped by more than 75%. Fixing the small visible cracks didn't just clean up appearances, it rebuilt an entire culture of order, respect, and accountability from the ground up. That's the model. That's what you're going to apply to yourself. I call it the window repair method. 4 moves to stop the erosion and rebuild what's cracked before it's gone entirely. Step 1. Patch the smallest crack first. Don't wait until the big promises fail. Fix the small ones. Show up when you say 5 minutes, not 15. Follow through on the tiny commitments nobody's tracking, because you're the one tracking them, and your own self-respect is built or broken in those invisible moments. Step 2. Stop narrating your worth. Cut the unsolicited explanations. Make the decision, state it once, and let it stand. Justification is a broken window. Silence, calm, grounded silence, is the repair. Step 3. Regulate before you react. The half-second pause between stimulus and response is where all your future respect either survives or dies. Build that pause. Breathe before you reply. Let the amygdala hijack pass before your mouth catches up to your emotions. Step 4. Reintroduce scarcity. Stop being infinitely available. Stop bending every boundary to keep the peace. A no said occasionally is what makes your yes worth something at all. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Respect was never about being liked more. It was never about being agreeable, available, or endlessly accommodating. Respect is a byproduct of predictable integrity. The quiet, consistent signal that you are the same person under pressure as you are in comfort, that your word holds weight, and that your boundaries hold shape. You don't need to become harsher, colder, or more guarded to protect it. You need to become someone who fixes broken windows the moment they appear. Instead of waiting until the whole structure has been stripped for parts by people who, quietly, stopped believing anyone was watching. So, look around at your own life right now. Somewhere, there's a window with a crack in it. Maybe it's a boundary you've let slide. Maybe it's a promise you've broken twice this month. Maybe it's the way you explain yourself to people who never asked. Find it and fix it. Today, not eventually. Because eventually is exactly how a pristine car in a quiet neighborhood ends up stripped to the frame. If you watch this video all the way to the end, that already tells me something about you. You're one of the rare few actually willing to look for the cracks before they spread. That's not a small thing. If this gave you something worth carrying into your own life, hit like, subscribe, and stay close for the next one. Because we're only getting started on what's really shaping the way people see you.